Well, good morning, Harlan. It's great to be with you today. We're going to be starting a new series today called Victory in the Battles That Matter. And we'll be talking about this for the month of February. And I think we can all agree that we are in a very unique context. And in this context, we are all facing battles that we never thought we would have to face. And I suspect that wherever you're watching from, you would say, yeah, you know what? It feels like I'm in a battle right now, and I'm just trying to survive. I'm trying to get through. Now, in this series, which I'm really excited about, you might be wondering, well, victory in the battles that matter. Well, which battles? Which battles matter? And this is where it can get confusing and maybe even controversial. Now, because there are some who would say that the political battle right now matters more than anything else. And please don't misunderstand me. I think, the politics are important to talk about to a degree and kind of the related conversations that are surrounding that. But is that the most important battle right now? In fact, I even know of, some churches that are doing entire sermon series on political battles and things of that nature, which I'm not saying is wrong. But I just wonder, as a pastor, I'm not a politician, I'm a pastor. As a pastor, is that the most important battle right now? And if you've noticed, I largely stay silent on a lot of these issues. Not that I always will, but I'm just wondering right now in this season, what is the most important battle? What is the fiercest battle right now that you are facing? The battle that's so important right now in your life. And it's a really important question because victory in the wrong battle can lead to defeat in areas where you need to experience victory because you only have so much emotional capacity for stress. And if you lose all that capacity watching the news, then what happens to your marriage? What happens to your children? Because if you're not careful, investing in an area or a battle that does not need investment can leave you drained and unprepared for areas where you need to experience victory, areas that you probably cannot afford to lose. And so that's why in this series, I'm just defining the battles that matter as battles that are happening right here in your heart, soul, and mind. The battle that you face every day when you wake up and you don't know how you're going to make it through the day. The battle that you face when you go home, perhaps to your family. And even though you have walked in the door, it feels like somebody else has walked in the door because every day you just don't feel like yourself anymore as the fear and the panic and the worry and all that starts to set in. And so I want to spend the month of February talking about the battle in our hearts, our souls, our minds, and the effect that it's having on around us. And specifically today, I want to talk to you about the stress of unexpected storms because this is a battle right now because you are probably facing or you know someone who is facing an unexpected storm as people are losing their jobs or getting forced pay cuts or the emotional stress at home. Home used to be a refuge for many people, but now as the stress and the pressure mounts, it just seems like home isn't the safe haven it used to be. It feels like you have nowhere to go. It just feels like you're stuck. In fact, it almost feels like a psychological and a spiritual claustrophobia. You feel trapped. Now with physical claustrophobia, like you're constrained, the walls are closing in. But in reality, this kind of feels like a paradox because you can go out. Yes, you have to exert caution and wisdom and follow guidelines, of course, but you can go grocery shopping. You can go outside for walks. You can exercise outside. You actually can go places. You probably have a vehicle, but it just feels like that. This psychological and spiritual claustrophobia. You have freedom, but it just feels like the storms around you are surrounding you and they're just coming in. And in this place of feeling trapped, fear replaces faith. Panic replaces prudence. Worry replaces wisdom. In this place, it just feels like everything's coming in and it feels like there's absolutely nothing you can do as the storms of life keep getting worse and worse and worse. And so in this series, I want to talk about those battles on the inside that we all have to face. And I think in this season, in a much more heightened way. Now, I do want to note that in this series, when we talk about stress and fear and panic and worry and the effects that it can have, oftentimes these emotions exist in unison. Very rarely do you feel panic without feeling fear. Very rarely do you feel fear without feeling worry. These emotions overlap. And so as we talk about these, you're going to see this overlap, although we're going to do our very best to hone in on one of those specific elements. And so for me today is going to be this idea of stress. Now, the passage that we're going to read today is likely one you've heard before. It's found in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 8. Leading up to chapter 8 and the earlier part of chapter 8, Jesus had just finished a full day of ministry, performing wonders, the likes of which this world had never seen. And towards the end of the day, he said to his disciples, let's go over to the other side of the lake. And this is where our passage starts, Luke chapter 8, starting in verse 22. One day Jesus said to his disciples, let's go over to the other side of the lake. And so they got into a boat and set out. Now this lake, by the way, is actually the Sea of Galilee. If you've been there, it's about 13 miles long, 7 miles wide, and it sits in a depression that's 700 feet below sea level with mountains on the east side. And so what happens is, as the cold air comes off the mountains and mixes with the warm air, well, that creates storm-like conditions. But on this day, there was no sign of danger. On this day, we can presume that it was clear skies. There was no threat of a storm coming. And on top of that, part of Jesus' disciples, there were a few of them who were experienced fishermen who had fished on the Sea of Galilee, probably their whole lives. Maybe even it was a generational trade. And so they had every reason to think, you know what, this is going to be just an average, simple boating trip to the other side. There was no sign of danger. But as they sailed, Jesus fell asleep. Interesting, it's going to mention that twice in this passage. And a squall came down on the lake so that the boat was being swamped and they were in great danger. Now, in the Gospel of Matthew, there's 4 Gospels. In the Gospel of Matthew, he gives a parallel account or his point of view of what was happening. And in his point of view, he said that the storm or the squall came suddenly, meaning it came without warning, meaning they didn't see it coming. And interestingly, in all of this, Jesus was still asleep. In fact, the disciples went and woke him up saying, Master, Master, we are going to drown. In this moment, you get a sense of that fear and the stress and the worry and the panic. And I want you to know that all those emotions are valid. And oftentimes we experience them together. But what's also valid, which seems to have become invalid, are Jesus' words. Because Jesus said, we're going to the other side. Jesus said we're going to make it, but all of a sudden, Jesus' words had no value because of a few drops of rain coming from the heavens, because all of a sudden the storms hit. And I get it. It was a big storm, but regardless of the size of the storm, they forgot what Jesus had said. And so Jesus said to them, where is your faith? He asked his disciples. And I don't think Jesus had a problem with his disciples coming to him for help. That's really the essence of our faith. We know we are in trouble. And so we go to Christ because he gives hope and forgiveness and mercy and joy. The problem, I think, is that state of panic and that state of fear that they allowed to consume them. And going back to that parallel account in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus said in that account, "O you of little faith." And so when he asks, where is your faith? Like, did you lose it? Or when he says, "O you of little faith," these are figures of speech, but they're confusing figures of speech, because what does Jesus mean by them? And we'll talk about it in a few moments. And so this passage ends with this: in fear and amazement, they asked one another, "Who is this? He commands even the winds and the water, and they obey him." See, they didn't expect an unexpected storm, but they also didn't expect that the one in the boat with them had the power to deal with the unexpected storm that hit their lives. Despite all they had seen Jesus do, it never occurred to them that he could do it again. And honestly, I don't blame them. I mean, when you're in a context like that, it is hard to focus even on things that we would say are common sense. Many years ago, my wife and I went on a cruise for our honeymoon. And I think it was like one day a storm had come, and it wasn't a big deal. I mean, we were perfectly safe. There was no danger. But still, the idea of being on a boat or big boat, during a storm at sea was kind of cool. And I remember, we were sitting next to the window, and the rain was hitting the window, and you could hear the sound of the waves. It was a And it was actually so loud that it was really hard to hear the conversation that you were having with your spouse. And so my wife was saying something to me, but I just couldn't hear her because of all the sound. But on top of that, it was just hard to focus because I was so captivated. I was so mesmerized by the context and the situation that we're in. And that's what happens, doesn't it? It consumes your attention. Now, again, in my context, it was more of a leisurely storm on a cruise, but in this context, it was a fearful storm, a storm where they thought they could lose their lives. They were in a context that literally consumed their attention and blinded them to everything and everyone else, including who was in the boat, because the person in the boat had the power to do something about their context. And they learned, I'm just rephrasing here, but you cannot let the cause of your stress distract you from what God can do in your context. You cannot let the cause of your storm blind you to who is in the boat with you. You cannot let the storms of your life blind you to the deliverance that God has already declared over you, because what good is praying for a miracle if unmitigated and unmanaged stress blind you to what God has the power to do in your context? But that's the nature of stress, isn't it? That's the nature of these kinds of emotions, because stress, and of course fear and worry and panic, but stress craves attention. I had a friend many years ago who really struggled with stress and panic. And what made it really hard to help them was that they just didn't see the world, or they couldn't see the world the way I saw the world. Where I saw a road, they saw a roadblock. Where I saw an opportunity, they saw an obstacle. And it's not that they were being difficult, it's just that they couldn't take their eyes off the stress, and that changed the way they saw life. Because the focus of your attention can change your mental disposition. You can end up believing things emotionally that intellectually are not true. For example, there are some of you, and maybe you're watching right now, and you believe that this pandemic will never end. Intellectually, that is absurd. Every pandemic we've ever faced has ended largely without the help of pharmaceuticals. And intellectually, you know that to be true. But emotionally, it's just hard to believe right now. Why? Because you're in a storm and you can't take your eyes off the storm. Some of us are even experiencing a low-grade depression. You're managing, but the cracks are starting to form. And you're scared that if this goes on much longer, that this is going to be the new you. And emotionally, maybe you believe that, but I suspect intellectually, this doesn't have to be true. Intellectually, you know that with a good diet, good exercise, prayer, reading the Word of God, perhaps good medication, good counseling, you know that you can actually be stronger. Intellectually, that's a common sense way of thinking. We know that to be true, but emotionally, it's probably just hard to believe right now because of the context that we're in. It's changing our mental disposition because you're in the storm. And honestly, how can it not? I mean, when you look at what the disciples did, how they responded, they went and they woke him saying, Master, Master, we are going to drown. Really? We are going to drown? Jesus, my storm is going to kill you. Jesus, my storm is too much for you. Jesus, the problem in my marriage is something that you cannot do anything about because it's just too big. It's just too intense. Jesus, the challenge I'm facing with my children, with the prodigal loved ones in my life, there's nothing you can do about it because my storms are just too big. My storms have the power to ruin your plans for all time. Because why? We are going to drown. And you have to be careful how you use the word we and what comes after the word we. Because if Jesus really is in the boat, if he's really in the boat, then it's not we're going to drown, it's we're going to be delivered. We're going to be blessed. Even if God doesn't give me what I want, we are not going to be abandoned. We are in a boat with a God who loves us and cares for us. Now, in the disciples' defense, though, he was sleeping, but just because he was sleeping, it didn't mean that he didn't care. He just didn't give the storm the same kind of attention that the disciples gave the storm. Now, he dealt with it, but he didn't give it the same kind and amount of attention that the disciples gave the storm. And really, his response is a reminder for us that we need to be mindful of how much attention that we give the storms of life. You have to deal with it. Of course, you may even need the supernatural power of God to deal with the storms of life. You may even need to exert wisdom on how to deal with the storms of life, but it still doesn't justify how much attention we give to the storms of life. Because if you can learn to be mindful of how much attention you give the storms of life, you can be blessed in the stress. You can be blessed in the stress. Now, maybe you're reading this and you're thinking, really? Blessed in the stress? Pastor, you were probably just looking for a statement that rhymed. And yes, I was, but I believe it. You can be blessed in the stress. Not just you can feel blessed. You can actually literally be blessed in the stress. And I have found that, there's a stigma around this idea of stress in Christian culture. So for example, in non-Christian literature, there is a robust dialogue about how to deal with unhealthy, bad, or chronic stress, but there's also a robust dialogue on how to manage and maximize good stress, because good stress has good effects. It heightens memory, response time, things of that nature. For example, if you have a paper due, which is like the story of my life, if you have a paper due, well, that's stressful, but you can channel that stress into productivity so that you can get your paper done on time. And so, this practical, this psychological, and the medical dialogue surrounding healthy stress is actually not controversial or shameful in non-Christian literature. And oddly enough, Jesus Christ experienced what you could describe in part as stress. And I only say in part because I think human words fail to describe the weight of what he carried. What Jesus carried, our sin, created so much anguish that he actually sweat drops of blood, which is hard to believe. I think it's a medical condition as well, or the blood capillaries burst over here because of the stress. But the Bible goes on to say in Hebrews chapter 12, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross. But think about that the word joy is in the same sentence as the crucifixion. I know in our minds, when we picture Jesus on the cross, we see it as an act of love, that even though it was painful and shameful and, just the excruciating element of being crucified, we attach love to that experience. But in Hebrews, the Hebrew writer attaches joy. He felt joy on the cross. And if it's possible to experience joy in a crucifixion, is it not possible to be blessed in the stress? In fact, to take it even one step further, is it possible to be blessed in the stress when God chooses not to remove the stress from your context? Now, I'm not advocating for chronic stress. I'm aware of the dangers of unhealthy stress. And I believe that God can make a difference. He can bring the calm. But what if the way God responds is not the way you had hoped? When we read this in the latter part of verse 24, Jesus got up, rebuked the wind and the raging waters, and the storm subsided, and all was calm. Commentators say that this passage would have been very significant for the early church because they faced this unbelievable persecution. And this calm was likely what they prayed for, except they never got it. In fact, the calm that they got was more in their hearts than it was in the political and the physical reality around them. And, when I think about the early church, I get the sense that sometimes we romanticize the early church. Last week, Pastor Gary Stagg, who's the executive director of Open Doors Canada, they support and serve the persecuted church. They released their 2021 World Watch List, the 50 most dangerous countries to be a Christian. And I actually read through many of these countries, as I read, just tears in my eyes because of the incredible persecution that they're facing. And as I read this, I thought about the early church. And I realize, and maybe you don't, but certainly I have, we tend to romanticize the pain and the fear and the stress and the worry and the panic right out of the historical narrative, when the truth is they experienced all those things then. They experience all those things today. In fact, their lives then and the persecuted church today is a perfect example that there is grace and blessing even when God doesn't bring the calm, even when God doesn't bring the kind of calm that you want in that specific context. And maybe you're wondering, okay, well then how do you survive? How do you survive the storm? How do you get blessed in the stress? And just speaking personally, in my life, most of my storms never disappeared. I just had to sail through them. And, sometimes people will, ask me, sometimes it'll become a topic of conversation, just a little bit of my story. I don't typically share too many pieces of my story in our messages. I'm happy to share it personally. But I left a religion that historically is very hard to leave. And there was a point in my life where I was diagnosed with cancer, and we walked through that journey. And then I had a fairly significant back injury, kind of figuring out how to walk again and things of that nature. And believe it or not, that there's actually some more intense stuff that we've gone through. Maybe in 10, 15 years, we'll feel healed enough to talk more about it. But as people hear this kind of stuff, they look at me and they go, wow, you're so strong in your faith. How did you make it through? And I can see it in their eyes, like they look at me like and you probably don't feel this way, but I've had it where people look at me like, I'm just like this pillar of faith. And honestly, when they do, I just feel like I'm an idiot. Like I feel so stupid and dumb because I know the truth that I'm not strong in my faith. And so they ask me like, how did you make it through? And, I just, imagine if this Bible was Jesus and they say, how did you make it through? Well, it's simple. I held on. I held on for dear life. And then they say, well, yeah, but you're a pastor, like the Bible, you're getting your doctorate degree. That's why. And I can honestly tell you that my professional experience, my personal experience as it relates to my resume does not compare with the power of his presence in the boat of my life. In fact, I would dare say that relying on experience or just experience can change stress to distress. It can make things exponentially worse. Now, don't get me wrong. I think experience is important. It's a gift, but it's not always enough to deal with unexpected and stressful storms of life. I mean, even this passage is a perfect example that experience was not enough. We read in Luke chapter 8, but if you go back a few chapters in chapter 5, when Jesus first met some of these disciples, Jesus said to Simon, put out in the deep water and let down the nets for a catch. And Simon answered, Master, we've worked hard all night. Anybody with boating experience will tell you that boating at night is incredibly dangerous. If you're a new sailor or a new boater, whatever the word is, mariner, whatever the word is, don't go at nighttime. You need to be an expert. You need to have good experience to do this at nighttime. And we haven't caught anything, but because you say so. You don't know what you're talking about, Jesus. We do. We do this for a living. We've done this all our lives, maybe even generations. We know what we're doing, but we'll indulge you. They were experienced. They had the kind of experience one would need to handle the Sea of Galilee. Now, I'll tell you what the funny thing is. These were the people you wanted. Like if you were drowning, would you want a professional video gamer or would you want a seasoned lifeguard? If you were in a storm on the Sea of Galilee, would you not want fishermen who have worked on that sea for years, decades, maybe even generations and had all that cumulative experience? These are the people you wanted. They had experience, but the context was just overwhelming. And the irony is that it wasn't even experience that they were lacking, because remember the question, where is your faith? Remember in the Gospel of Matthew, that parallel account where Jesus said, oh, you of little faith, essentially meaning the same thing. But it got me thinking, why is Jesus asking this question? Why did Jesus expect them to have great faith? And was having faith a fair expectation given the circumstance? And to really dig a little deeper, what does this question honestly mean? What does where is your faith mean? Like, is Jesus saying, guys, you're at a 4.5, but if you can just get to a 5.7, well, I can work with that. Is that what he's saying? No, I don't think it is. So what does it mean? And there are, several different interpretations. I tend to just have a common sense, plain English reading. I just say, well, if that's the question, is the answer in the text? And when you read the text, there seems to be a practical and yet a profound implication for why Jesus asked this question, where is your faith? And we even read it, and maybe like me, you just missed it. But Jesus said, one day, Jesus said to his disciples, let's go over to the other side of the lake. Let's go over to the other side. Jesus decided that we were here and we're going to go there. Jesus said we're going to the other side of the lake. Jesus said that we are here, but we're going to go there. Jesus declared that regardless of what our context is, I said we're going to be there. And if Jesus said we're going to be there, what makes you think you're going to be stuck here? If Jesus said we're going to make it through, then why would you not think you are going to make it through? If Jesus declared we are here, but we are going to be there, then let hell and high water come, because what Jesus said will come to pass. But they lost sight of what Jesus said because of the storm, because of the drops of water. And so they had to learn something that I think you and I need to learn today. We need to learn to do this, especially when unexpected storms strike. You need to hold on to the word that you've already heard. Hold on to the word you've already heard. God has said you are forgiven. God still has a plan for your life. Even as we prepare to take communion, despite whatever storm you may be facing on the inside or outside, is what this represents still true? Are you still forgiven? Are you still loved? Is Jesus still with you? Does he still have a plan for your life? And the answer is yes. But you need to hold on to what he's already said. Hold on to what he's already declared over your life, because no storm will change his word over your life. And so as we prepare to take communion, there's just two questions that I want to ask you today. Do I trust him to get me through? Do I trust him even when God brings the calm, but the calm is not what I had expected? Do I have the faith to continue believing that the word he said will come to pass? Do I have the faith to continue believing that his promises are still yes and amen despite the storms in and around my life? Do we as a church, do we trust him to get Heartland through? There are a lot of challenges churches are facing right now with, finances and kind of supplies and things of that nature. But do we trust him? Do we trust him that God is going to bring us through? I've said to you many times that the best days of Heartland, as good as they were, are not behind her, they're ahead of her. Is that still true? Or has some microscopic virus changed the plans of God over this church? Is what this represents still true? Because if it is, more than anything else today, you and I need to hold on to the word that we have already heard. If Jesus said we're going to make it through to the other side, you are going to make it. And that's what this represents. This bread over here just represents his broken body, which was not only broken for us, but it's a symbol of the victory that he procured for us. Victory in the battle that matters. For me, it's just water. For you, it's likely grape juice. But it's a representation of his shed blood, symbolizing the forgiveness for our sins, because he gave us victory in our hearts, souls, and minds for us to be free to pursue him despite what we are facing. And if this is still true, if it's still true, then you can experience victory today in the battle that matters. And so as we partake of communion, I hope and pray you can answer yes to these questions. Yes, I trust him to get me through. Yes, we trust him to get us through. And so take this little piece of bread, which represents his broken body. Take the cup, which represents his shed blood, which together represents the victory that he procured for us on the cross. Father, as we just enter into a time of worship, I pray, God, that you would let faith rise up, the kind of faith that compels and captivates us so that we are deciding to take our focus off the storms of life and to fix our eyes on the author of life, the one who has the power to do all things. In Jesus' name, amen. Church, let's worship together before we go.